Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of the Fair Housing and Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Angela McIver is a national leader and advocate for fair housing for all. Angela joined the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania in 2007 or 2007 as Chief Executive Officer. In 2016, she was appointed to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and 2 years later, she was elected to the board of the National Fair Housing Alliance. Angela has 29 years of experience and specializes in serving as a systems analyst by developing customized business solutions, institutional and organizational networking, community partnerships, and coalitions affecting adults and youth, and identifying social intersections, and solutions, and is currently pursuing her licensure as an expert in trauma. Angela produced the two-time award-winning independent film, Life Isn't Fair. In 2018, she created and released an independent docuseries entitled Memoir of a Home, a short biography featuring residents and a historical account of their address and community. In 2014, she was the recipient of the Willow Grove branch of the NAACP Humanitarian Award for Community Service. She earned her Bachelor's of Science in Behavioral Science from Pennsylvania State University. She also earned a Master's of Social Services and a Master of Law in Social Policy from Bryn Mawr College. Welcome, Angela. Thank you for being our guest today on PHRC Speaks.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Adrian.
It's not as if we wake up, although I've been met with some that actually did wake up and decide, I am going to go into civil rights. But I'd like to have our audience kind of become familiar with where that spark, that fire for civil rights and housing justice comes from in your case.
Thank you for the question. I have to blame that on my mother, in part because, growing up in the 70s, even though I'm a baby of the 60s, but growing up in the 70s in my household, for many African Americans, there was this trio that we saw on the wall. It was Jesus, Martin Luther King Jr., and John F. Kennedy. So having Martin Luther King Jr. or the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the wall was something that always fascinated me. Behind me is a mirror, because this used to be my studio. I've transformed it into my new office workspace. But if you look ahead, you'll see a picture of Dr. King. So every day I get to look at him, or he's looking at me as I'm working. And I've always felt a strong connection to Dr. King. I was born just weeks after his assassination. And because of my timing, the timing in which he left this earth and he left the Fair Housing Act behind, and fast forward to 2007, when I would be relieved from a position, I got a call one day into the office and was told, we are phasing out this job. So it's been nice working with you. And rather than being devastated about that, I started looking for new employment. And when I saw an opening with the Fair Housing Rights Center, I read the job description and applied. And much to my surprise, I received the letter, and it invited me to start this journey, and immediately finding out that Dr. King is really at the core of fair housing was very pleasing to me, because it goes back to me looking at him on the wall, being born weeks after his assassination, learning about him when I was a younger woman, and then seeing how that connected to my work, which is now in fair housing, where I've been for the last 14 years. So it's a very personal and near and dear story for me.
So my next question, as an enforcement agency, the PHRC investigates housing discrimination claims. Now, the FHRC operates as a Fair Housing Initiatives program. So as such, you work closely with the clients, with the individuals that have suffered discrimination. Can you share a little bit about that dynamic? Talk to us about how the FIP kind of can work a little closer with individuals.
So as a fair housing enforcement so there's so much jargon. We throw it around internally. So for the audience, I'm going to just slow down a moment and define what we're talking about here. So the Fair Housing Rights Center's mission is to ensure equal access to housing opportunities for all people. It's such a short mission statement, but it's also very huge and critical. So ensuring housing opportunities, to me, that's the most important part of that sentence. So by ensuring housing opportunities through our programs, we're able to conduct intakes, we're able to investigate claims of discrimination. We can help people through our enforcement program, meaning we have an attorney or at least someone who's been through law school who helps the client file the complaint. And then we are there for them throughout the time that we file the complaint until there's resolution. So they're not alone through that process. We recognize how vulnerable they are in that process. And some people are more vulnerable than others, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about that. But from what I say, start to finish, we handhold the client through the process. And, literally from the onset, so when the intake begins, we're asking a lot of questions. We also will ascertain the state of mind that someone is in. Sometimes that first contact is not the right time to ask certain questions. So once we determine whether or not it's appropriate, we move forward. And if not, we'll delay until we're able to. But we spend a lot of time getting background information from people. Because as you know, when people come to you, oftentimes, unless they've taken time to write a timeline or to write in chronological order what has happened to them, the information is in their mind. We just have to help them pull it out and put it in order. And that's how we build a case with someone.
Yeah.
As people recall things, then we're jotting down that information. Oh, and by the way, does that new memory also have with it maybe an existing document, some evidence that you can support that remark with so that we now have that in our possession because that strengthens your case? So we're spending a lot of time with the clients. And when we're not working directly with clients, we're working on their behalf because we're advocating at the federal, state, and local level. There's policies in place that are fantastic, and when they're in place and they're great, they have to be enforced, and that's where your agency comes in. Then there are missing policy pieces. So we're advocating for the implementation of policy that's non-existent because it will help improve fair housing conditions for all in the Commonwealth. And if I can just say one more thing about this, misinformation is certainly detrimental to all of us. And I'm bringing that up because sometimes people don't see themselves within the context of the Fair Housing Act. And they're there. They're there because we all need housing. So it doesn't matter who you are. You are a member of at least one protected class. If it's not on the federal level, it's on the state level or on a local level or a combination of all of the above. Everybody under the sound of my voice is a member of at least one protected class. So through the miseducation campaigns that we've seen over the years, and especially the ones that are happening right now, there are some folks who may not think that a fair housing law is for them. It's for everyone. Let's clear that up right now. It's for everyone. And that is if you are a home seeker or you're renting, you're purchasing a home, or if it's someone who's responsible for providing housing or those related services, you have obligations to people of all walks of life when it comes to housing.
Talk to me a little bit. You mentioned handholding, you mentioned state of mind. And so I want people to understand how the mind is affected when your home is threatened. And I mean, I often comment to people that the first thing a person does when they're being evicted from the home is they call off work. They call off work because they're in survival mode. Has that been your experience? Can you talk a little bit about that trauma of losing one's home?
When we are under attack, threatened in any way, whether it's our housing, our health, a loved one, shocking information, oftentimes we're no longer thinking from our executive properties, no longer from the prefrontal cortex. Pardon me for pointing, can't help that. But yes, we move from out of our prefrontal cortex, where we do our what I call past, present, future thinking, where we can plan, elaborate, all of those great things. And we move to the other parts of our brain, where other functions are taking place, where we're in fight or flight mode. So the moment we are under attack, we are no longer in that fore of our mind. We've moved to an emotional state, or literally we are in fight or flight, capitulations, or it could very well be freeze or submit mode, because there are different responses that we may have depending on the level of attack and the type of responses we've given in the past. When some people are under attack, they freeze. Mm-hmm. Some people will fight because they've learned how to fight under attack. Others will submit because they have probably done that before, or it's a calculated decision. Now is not the time to put up the fight. I'll just disassociate from this experience or pretend like I'm really not here so I can survive it, and then I'll come back and fight later. So there are different things that go on inside of us depending on our own life experiences, whether or not we have been taught to respond in various ways when we're under attack. And that's what we end up doing. And it is so important to recognize that in the moment with people, just because someone may say, let's say it's housing, and housing discrimination is occurring in real time in a person's life, and you may be calling them a racial epithet, and they're not saying a word to you, and you're thinking, I got you. Well, just because they don't respond in the moment doesn't mean they won't later. After they have a moment to gather themselves, feel safe, process what has happened, decide if it was something that they triggered or not, and then they reach for the phone to call to complain. That is a real possibility. It may be exactly how someone walks through the steps of going from the attack to the complaint. And that's just one example.
Right.
But yes, when people experience housing discrimination to the extent that they feel threatened by that, oftentimes the brain will stop working the way that it typically would, and the experience may or may not be stored in their emotional state. We call that the amygdala, So that's where an emotion occurs, very happy or very upsetting. And when we're working with someone who's gone through an emotional experience in which in their mind they experience trauma, because what trauma may be traumatic for me may not be for you or the next person, but for that individual, it takes a little bit of time to help pull that experience out of them, because the information doesn't go in sequential order. It goes in through their body because it's a physical experience that they've encountered. It's an electrical jolt that their bodies experience. So we'll have to help them pull the information out. Oftentimes they'll recall it through their senses. They'll think about what they smelled, what they saw, what they felt, or they see a color or they hear a word and it'll remind them of something. And then the information will start to come out of them. So, and it's very important that staff and I are aware of what trauma is like in an individual and how you work with an individual who's been traumatized in this context, housing discrimination, so that we don't expect them the first time they talk to us to tell us the entire story. If somebody can tell me the entire story the first time, they probably did not experience trauma, but they're probably very upset. Yeah. And they have every right to complain because that is their constitutional right.
Absolutely. You made a very good point, and I often talk to investigators about this as well. there's trauma on both sides of that equation. There's the trauma from the individual that's been discriminated against or is going through that housing injustice. And then there's also a trauma that staff, like your staff, absorb on a daily basis with every call, with every email, with every client, and particularly those that have really advanced mental difficulties or emotional difficulties that they absorb. How do you suggest to your staff that they self-care in those? Because this is affecting not just that family, now it's affecting you're going home with it. I mean, I can't tell you those calls I would get at Friday, 4:45 in the afternoon. I just got evicted. I don't know where to go. I've got 2 kids. We're sleeping in the car tonight. It's 23 degrees outside. You know, it was impossible for me not to take that home. Could you talk and elaborate a little bit about that as well?
Sure, and that's a really good question. So when I heard that, 3 terms came to mind. Number one, you want to do we as administrators, leaders, want to do everything in our power to avoid our own burnout and to ensure that our staff does not burn out while they're working, or even get to the point where they're experiencing what we call compassion fatigue. Because on a daily basis, they're being subjected to things that wear them down. They're carrying that, like you said, they're basically internalizing those experiences. And when people internalize, it's because what? You identify with something. You know, we hire folks who are compassionate, who are empathetic. So compassionate and empathetic people are more empathic, if you will, than others. A psychopath and a sociopath's not empathic. Those are like a hallmark characteristic of someone who's a sociopath or a psychopath. Like someone could be bleeding and they could be causing the bleeding and they don't feel a thing. Doesn't bother them. But on the other hand, we're working in human services in which we are looking for people who have characteristics and qualities that help them to relate to other people. But we have to be mindful and help them monitor and be aware that they must balance work from life, because they are subjected to what we call vicarious trauma, since they're hearing these traumatic stories day in, day out. And it's not enough to tell folks to engage in self-care. As leaders, we have to model to them what self-care looks like. For example, it looks like having healthy boundaries. Be more detailed. A healthy boundary could very well be work ends at 5 o'clock. And the only time work doesn't end at 5 o'clock is if there's an emergency or a crisis, or there's something we started we have to get done because there's a deadline. And then if there is a deadline and we're working to achieve that at the end of it, now we're going to take more time to care for ourselves so we can rebound from that extra work that we did. So we also have to send the message that I don't need you to feel guilty about answering emails every time one comes in. If I send one at 9 o'clock, I don't want you to read it at 9 o'clock. And I've learned as a leader, if I don't want them to read it at 9, then I have to check that little box to tag to send it at 9 a.m. the next morning. Because I don't want them to feel bad about it at night if they're looking at it. Because I really don't want them to look at it at night.
I just learned that. I just learned that not so long ago, and I'm glad that I did, even though I try not to do that. You know, getting back to that trauma in housing, we saw we continue to see during this COVID pandemic, that because people are working at home, we have seen an increase in sexual harassment in the home. Domestic violence has been increased during the pandemic. And so there's trauma. And then we have, since the moratoriums have lifted in many areas, we have some evictions that at the heels of it is a domestic violence issue. And too oftentimes, it is the victim of domestic violence that usually ends up getting the raw deal out of being evicted or out of that relationship and losing their home. Can you talk a little bit about that intersectionality between that sexual harassment, the trauma, and fair housing, and how that all kind of works together?
The protection that links sexual harassment or even domestic violence to the Fair Housing Act or the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act is going to be gender or sex or LGBTQ+. So it's going to be something in that rubric. There's been research that indicates that 85% of women who have disclosed that they were victims of domestic violence have reported that. Now, it doesn't mean that men aren't victims. I know I've come in contact with men who've been victims of domestic violence, but more women report. That's the issue. More women end up reporting. So anyone who's being victimized in their housing should report. But in this case, we're talking about domestic violence or even sexual harassment for that matter. People have the right under the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, housing provisions that your agency enforces, and they need to look at within their local jurisdiction if there are protections. I live in Philadelphia County. Philadelphia has protections for people who are who disclose that they are their status as someone who's being a victim of domestic violence. All have protections. You have to report it. Now, there's a few things that happen here. On one hand, the individual who's experienced it should report it. On the other hand, the housing provider has to become aware if there's an obligation that they must adhere to. Because if we're talking about the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Violence Against Women Act is also linked to it in this case. If someone lives in public housing, and under that circumstance, the housing provider should be willing to bifurcate a lease so that they can allow the person who is inflicting the violence to go, separate them from the lease, from the person who is being harmed, and perhaps the children, if the children are going to stay with that individual. That way, an entire family does not become homeless as a result of domestic violence. Now, for my private housing providers, here's what I say to them. You have to think about your public relations. You have to think about how do you stay in front of maintaining good public relations when it comes to you being a housing provider. Oftentimes people are fearful and say things like, well, I don't want them to, destroy my property. And I completely understand that. I truly do. But again, if there's something that you can do that can assist a family who's clearly vulnerable in that moment, then work with the family. Don't penalize them for needing to get out of the lease, for needing to flee. And for goodness sake, whether it's public housing or private housing, you don't want to tell where someone has gone. Because when people escape, the ability to stay off of the radar is really important. And in some instances, it's going to be the only thing that protects them from being harmed more physically or even fatally wounded. So you want to maintain confidentiality and give people an option to leave with their dignity first so that they can maintain their person or that of their entire family. If we're talking about sexual harassment, well, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, HUD has two things to say about that, or the Fair Housing Act has two things to say about that. Housing providers have a responsibility of ensuring that tenants are not harassing each other and staff is not harassing tenants. That policy should be in writing, it should be visible, and it should be clear to people. That's why housing providers, their management staff, and all other people who work under them must get annual training and be reminded of sexual harassment, which can occur on the basis of quid pro quo. I'll give you this for that, and I'm just going to be direct because sometimes it's sex that people are looking for. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about trauma, I mentioned, fight, flight, freeze, submit, capitulate. Just because someone submit does not mean that they're not going to report you later. Mm-hmm. Just because they, freeze doesn't mean they're not going to report you later. Just because they, surrender in the moment doesn't mean they're not going to report you later. They absolutely have the right to report you later. Even if they fight you, you might think, well, they fought me back. That's it. No, they have a right to pursue that because you have violated their space in housing. So the housing provider must be very clear, must ensure that everyone is being trained. And aside from quid pro quo, it's also that hostile environment that our complainants will come to us and disclose, that I had to put up with somebody making comments about how I looked every day or asking me to go out. Or we had one instance in which someone had didn't ask, he said he wanted to violate the woman's disabled child. Very interesting things happen. Something that I have found has been common over the years, and that is, and I have to be very careful how I word this, because I have to be sensitive to people, and that's when it's maintenance staff, please stick to your maintenance job. When you fraternize, you almost open the door to even have to explain what you meant by the conversation that you had with a tenant. That's not your role. If you want to be hospitable, that's fine. But you have to know what the line is. And if you don't, that's why training is so important. Mm-hmm. You are going into people's homes, so you're seeing them sometimes in ways that other people who work on the property may not. It's not your duty to then go back and talk about that. It's not your duty to gossip with other tenants. It's not your duty to hit on the tenants. It is your duty solely to do the work order and then to get out of there as quickly as possible. It not only protects the tenant, but it is protecting you. That way there's no room for misinterpretation.
Yeah. So in the brief moments I have left, and believe me, I could make this a 1 hour show with you, Angela, but in the brief moments that I have left, explain to our audience how you see the PHRC and FHRC partnership, how it works. So some people might be curious as to when we talk about partnerships, what do they mean by that?
You are the state law enforcement agency. We don't have that authorization. Mm-hmm. We are the investigators. We work up the complaint. We will listen to folks and record the intake. You have the muscle to enforce the law. So it is essential that we have a good relationship. This vibe that people are watching right now, this is not fake. This is real. This is how we must work together, because I feed my work into your agency, and then your staff then handles the situation. You have the final say over what happens. You are the social justice component of the work in Pennsylvania. You are the face of social justice when it comes to housing, employment, education, public accommodations, but I'll hone in on housing since that's the piece that I am responsible for contributing to your agency. So yes, it is essential that we have an open, free line of communication and work flowing back and forth, because work can start with me, but it's going to end with you.
Yeah, no, Angela, thank you so much for being here on PHRC Speaks. I will bring you back because I'm sure that we can just continue on various topics. And for those that are tuning in, you might ask, well, why did we decide to talk about trauma? Well, if you look at our country's history and our civil rights journey, it's riddled with trauma. Trauma that some would say as a nation we have not healed from. But more directly, we speak about it because losing a home does lead to physical and mental health trauma. It increases the exposure to environmental hazards. It leads to food insecurities and malnutrition, and it also contributes to academic decline and job loss. That's why we continue to produce PHRC Speaks, and we invite experts like Angela McIver to the program so that we can share with you how PHRC works together with organizations like the Fair Housing Rights Center to enforce the civil rights in the 21st century. For more information, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in a housing transaction, you can visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or call us at 717-787-9780. We're also easy to find online on Facebook, PA Human Relations, and on Twitter at PA_HumRelCom. That's it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.